Hello and welcome to Before You Go, the podcast where we explore life, death, and everything in between. Today's episode is brought to you in partnership with Empika PR, and our guest today is someone with a truly remarkable story. Emma Britton is a funeral celebrant based in Bridgwater, Somerset. Since training with the United Kingdom Society of Celebrants in 2020, she supported more than 800 bereaved families, helping them to honour their loved ones with care and compassion. Before taking on this role, Emma spent 13 years as a BBC local radio presenter across Somerset and Bristol, so will be a voice many listeners will recognise if you are based in the southwest. In April this year, Emma's own life was turned upside down. Despite being a non-smoker, she was diagnosed with stage 4 ALK Positive lung cancer, a rare genetic cancer that is incurable, but thanks to modern medicine is hopefully manageable. Emma, thank you so much for joining me today. It's wonderful to have you here, and how are you doing today?
Oh, thank you, Matt. No, I'm really excited to be a guest on the podcast. Yeah, I'm doing okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm feeling all right and really looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you. Emma, I know it's been a really intense year for you, so I just wanted to say up front how much we appreciate you taking the time to share your story with us. I thought we could start by going back a little before all of the stuff around your diagnosis to your journey into becoming a celebrant. So, to start with, can you take us back to the moment you first decided to become a celebrant and what drew you into the work?
So I was working as a BBC local radio presenter. I was at BBC Radio Bristol at the time, hosting their breakfast show. And I'd been doing that for 4 or 5 years in Bristol. Prior to that, I'd done 8 years in Somerset. And I'd seen a real shift in society since sort of Brexit, and then as we went into the pandemic, I saw a real shift in society, the advancement of social media, how it became absolutely normal to express your opinions in public, regardless of whether those would be offensive or upsetting. And in local radio, I was at the front end of that, getting up at 3 o'clock every morning to drive to Bristol to host a 4-hour live radio show and listen to people's opinions, many of which were offensive to me and probably a lot of the population. But the kind of people who ring local radio stations are the kind of people who think their opinions are valid, and more often than not, they're not. And that's a sort of a brief overview, but really basically I became a little bit disillusioned, and I knew that being a local radio presenter was not going to see me through to retirement, and it was a job that I wasn't really getting much joy out of anymore. I'd had some brilliant times, some amazing experiences. It really was a job like no other, but I could see things were changing, and I was getting a little bit downhearted by the toxic nature of the media, the political state of the country, locally and nationally, internationally. And I thought, oh gosh, I need to do something. And I thought long and hard about what I wanted to do. I nearly went to work for Avon and Somerset Police, not as a police officer, although I would make a very good traffic cop. I have very strong views about middle lane hoggers on the motorway, but anyway. I nearly went to work in their comms team. I nearly went to work for EDF. I live in Bridgwater. They're building a nuclear power station on my doorstep. Again, a comms role. But I knew deep down I wanted to get away from anything that involved negativity. So I looked long and hard at what I loved about my broadcasting job. And I like meeting people, interviewing them, talking to them. I love writing, so a lot of my radio shows were scripted, although my job was to make them not sound scripted. And I love speaking publicly. And those are the real key ingredients, quality, skills of being a celebrant. And I'd been to a few celebrant-led ceremonies, and I'd been a little disappointed at the delivery, at the tone, at the content. And as a family, several years prior to that, we'd had an experience with a celebrant-led ceremony where the celebrant hadn't really taken time to understand our loved one and wrote in a very generic way rather than in a personal way. So I thought, I'm going to go and see what this is like. So I began my training with the UK Society of Celebrants whilst I was still broadcasting, and I qualified in February 2020. And I had a plan to go part-time at the BBC and see if I could do both and then make the switch, and then COVID happened. So I delayed my plans for a few months, and eventually the BBC had a voluntary redundancy scheme, so I was able to leave leave under that, and began my full-time career as a celebrant at the beginning of 2021, and I've been doing it ever since, and it really is like the best job I've ever had. I know I've had quite a few jobs in my time, but I think all those years of broadcasting and interviewing and meeting people in various states of situations in their lives has set me up to be hopefully a good celebrant.
Fantastic. Do you know what, you pointed out a little bit there about your experience of celebrant-led services, and in anticipation of us having this conversation, I was actually thinking about something that actually we don't really talk about. Within the funeral sector, we talk a lot about how funerals have changed, especially post-pandemic.
Yeah.
And actually, the role of the celebrant has changed as well. So I was trying to think back before the pandemic, and celebrants would come in and they would use what, to all intents and purposes, perhaps more of like a rinse and repeat kind of method, where actually a lot of it was scripted. There was a lot of changing of names, the odd poem here and a little bit in the eulogy, but actually it was very consistent. And funeral directors do like that because they know exactly what they're getting each time. But I have seen since kind of after the pandemic, we talk a lot about personalization and people wanted to do things in a slightly different way. And you see that in celebrancy as well, because there's more and more celebrants now, like yourself, having been to a funeral that you've led, where each one is different.
Yeah.
You know, it's really taking that time, starting to understand that individual, understand the family members and the friends and the story, and putting that all together to give a really holistic overview of that individual, and never hearing the same thing twice. And it is a personal perspective, but I think that's a beautiful thing.
Personalisation is key, I think, because we're all different individuals. We've all led different lives. The way I would write and conduct a funeral ceremony for a sweet little old lady in her 90s who never left her home village and made jam for the WI is very different to the way I would write and conduct a funeral ceremony of a rock star, you know, yeah, or of someone who died in prison. And, you know, I've done 2 out of those 3 scenarios. To guess which one I haven't done, but, you know, and so they can't be the same. And I get that continuity and that, you know, reliability is important, but this is the one chance we have to honour someone's time here on earth, and, you know, it really should be personal. Don't get me wrong, there are some situations where there really isn't much to go on. So, you know, maybe that person had led quite a straightforward life. Maybe that person was quite private. Maybe that family can't articulate words and memories of that person. So it's not easy to write a truly personal ceremony, which means that sometimes some ceremonies are a little more, shall we say, generic, or a little bit, you know, less personal, but it has to be right for the situation. And as celebrants, we are responsible for that. You know, I forget, the best way of describing a celebrant once was someone said, I'm a ceremony creator. We're not just sat there banging out, you know, X number of words and all that. We are creating bespoke ceremonies. And it's not easy, and it's not always appreciated by everyone in the industry. Personally, that's what gives me reward, and that's what brings me joy in my job, is knowing that I've done my best for that family and that person, because it's for both. It's for the deceased, but it's also for their loved ones as well.
Absolutely, and it's clearly something that is well received and well thought of, because I mentioned at the top of the podcast that you've looked after and supported over 800 families since you qualified. What of those experiences, you know, and there are a vast number of them, what have they taught you about grief and remembrance in general?
So the first, if you bear in mind, I qualified in February 2020. Although I didn't leave the BBC till the end of that year, I was doing possibly maybe 1 or 2 funerals a week. So my first possibly 100 ceremonies were all under COVID restrictions. So I had a really interesting introduction into my celebrant career. And so that was a challenge. That was a huge challenge. But now that life has gone back to, you know, a new kind of normal, I think for me, it's one of our biggest challenges is expectation. You know, when somebody dies, not everyone is prepared, planned, or even willing to accept it. And so as celebrants, when we are asked by funeral directors to look after a family, or in my case, I'm very lucky in that my reputation's established, and probably around half of the ceremonies I conduct are because families have asked for me, and I don't underestimate how blessed I am for that. But it is hard sometimes because you walk into all kinds of different situations, and it is quite tricky to manage expectations, to make sure you maintain good professional working relationships with your industry colleagues. And I don't just mean funeral directors, crematorium staff, burial ground staff. It's very, very important, because without all of us, that one moment in time doesn't go right, and we only have one chance to get it right. So I'm all about, collaborative working, but also the longer I've been a celebrant, I've become a little more discerning about who I choose to work alongside, because I want to maintain high standards. And although, everyone's standard who I have worked with have been fine, some are better than others. So, and you see that the industry is in the spotlight quite a bit in recent times, isn't it? So the general public are now questioning standards in the funeral industry. So we're all under a little bit of extra pressure, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. It's very tricky because, it's an industry that not a lot of people have an opinion on until they're required to be involved with it in some way, shape or form. And typically I would say that within kind of our role as a crematorium owner and operator, we spend quite a lot of time myth busting and trying to help and support people to understand what actually happens. And we do that through a number of ways. We do it through an open door policy. We do it by open days, working funeral director engagement events, even things like this. We're actually, we're trying to have conversations so that people can understand the real good that comes from the people within the sector. You mentioned there about walking into a whole number of different situations, and that would mean that you have to be very agile. And I'm going to assume here that in your role previously as a radio presenter, you would need to be incredibly agile at times. What other kind of skills do you think have translated particularly well from what you used to do to what you do now?
Yeah, agility definitely, because it's worth me possibly pointing out that I fell into radio by chance. I usually say by mistake, but it was never a mistake, because otherwise I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you now, Matt. But I used to run my own business as, this is a whole nother podcast, I was a fitness instructor. I taught exercise classes in the community for people who were overweight, because I've always been overweight in my adult life. That's a whole nother story. And I got invited onto the local radio station to be a guest, and then I became a regular contributor, and then a job came up at the station, answering the phones, making the tea, and the circumstances at the time meant that I was looking for some more secure employment because the recession was. And so that I started working for the BBC in 2007, and then 2 years later got given my own show. So when I first started radio presenting, I've got no degree, I didn't go to university, I didn't study journalism. I spent the first 2 or 3 years of my broadcasting life thinking, in a minute, the big bosses at the BBC are going to realise they've given a radio show to a woman who doesn't know anything, who used to come in and talk about exercising your bingo wings, But they never did. And as the years went by, I became more and more, established as a broadcaster. And agility is massive because it's live radio and you never know what's going to happen. There might be breaking news. There might be someone says something in an interview that you weren't expecting, good and bad. Something might go wrong technically. So I think I underestimated those agile skills in being a celebrant. So when I go in to see a family, obviously you've rung them and made that initial connection and arranged to go and see them or meet with them, because sometimes nowadays, meeting at funeral directors' premises might be more appropriate for some people for a variety of reasons. But you have to go in with an open mind and an open heart, but you're a bit like Sherlock Holmes, the modern one, where he's assessing everything, and he's assessing the room and he's assessing the atmosphere and he's assessing that body language. I'm not Sherlock Holmes, but I get a vibe, I get a sense. I think I'm what's known as an empath. I have empathy and I pick up on the way people are feeling. Because sometimes you walk into situations when people are bereaved and you can sense that there's something deeper than what you're just seeing on the surface, and you might have to tread more carefully, you might have to be diplomatic. You might have to afterwards revisit and say, I got a feeling there was something that wanted to be said that didn't get said. You know, you have to be so skilled at this. So yeah, lots and lots of transferable skills that I think that's why I always say I wouldn't have been a celebrant had I not been a broadcaster. And people think, oh, that's because you're good at speaking in public. It is so much more than speaking in public. In fact, I would say that that's an important part, but it's not the biggest part. You have to be so skilled in people, I think, to be a good celebrant.
I agree. I just kind of build on that, I guess. It's because I think obviously the people that attend funerals, they see the end product of all of your hard work, right? And so they see that for that 30 minutes, that 45 minutes. But actually, like you say, you have to have those people skills, those soft skills to be able to extract everything that you possibly can out of a family in the build up to that. And I know that from experience as well, having been around the table with people that are making funeral arrangements, actually that can be really hard sometimes because you mentioned it, you know, it might be that they just don't know enough, or actually they're in a place on their grief cycle actually that they're not really in the best place to give you all of that information. So I think it's an incredibly complex skill set that's required to do something. And even like you say, during the actual funeral itself, they don't always go as you expect them to.
Things can go wrong. And again, reading people helps with that, you know, like I will always support someone who wants to speak at a funeral. I'll always do that. However, I'll be very frank with them about how difficult that is to do that. And many a good tribute, eulogy, poem has been, I hesitate to use the word ruined because I don't mean that, but it's not been as good as it could be because of emotion. And I understand why as human beings we feel we should get up and speak. But one of the most common things I hear are, you know, oh, I didn't hear a word Auntie Carol said because she was crying, you know, and so you do, that is a real balance, you know. But I also get a sense of how someone maybe doesn't quite think they can do it, but I know they can. So I'll literally, you know, invite them forward to the lectern and I can sense, do they need me to stand closer to them? Do they need me to put my hand on their arm? Do they need me to whisper and say, remember to breathe, you know? So it's yeah, again, people skills.
It's a multifaceted kind of requirement of the celebrant role. That's ever growing, I think, as well. So it's been interesting to hear about that. I mentioned again earlier on that in April this year, your life kind of was turned upside down with the diagnosis of your ALK stage 4 cancer diagnosis. When you received your diagnosis earlier this year, how did it reshape your perspective on life and on your work?
So being diagnosed completely out of the blue with stage 4 incurable cancer is like something you see in a soap opera, you know. It was massive for us as you know, myself and my other half, and even now I don't think I've quite processed it, but I think in a way I found myself saying quite often in the early days of my diagnosis that because of my profession I have spent a disproportionate amount of time with people who have lost loved ones because of cancer, because I've sat with grieving families whose loved one has died because of cancer. And so I already had like an insider experience, because when you go and meet with a grieving family, they often share quite a lot of details with you about the end of their loved one's life or what their loved one went through. So I've probably, you know, heard a lot more of those experiences than your average person in the street. So I don't think that helped really initially. Because it's almost like I knew too much. However, I talk all the time, pre-diagnosis, I used to talk all the time about the fragility of life, you know, and I don't say it as a cliche. You know, I used to talk in ceremonies all the time about we do not know how long we're going to be blessed with, you know, and so we should try and make the most of life. So that has always been underpinning how I feel as well. Don't get me wrong, I'm not perfect. I've had way more bad days than I've had good, but I'm finding my way. So I think my profession has been a help, but also at sometimes just a little tiny bit of a hindrance as well. But I wouldn't change that for the world. I wouldn't change my job for the world.
It's a very interesting perspective. There was nothing really that was suggesting that you would have the form of cancer that you've got and things like that. And I guess from that perspective, Moving forward, how do you think that it will change the way that you connect with families in future?
I'm still not sure, Matt, if I'm honest. I have been fortunate enough to be supported by several amazing funeral directors who I've worked with over these last 5 years, who I work quite a lot for, who have not only been, supported me in their response to my initial news. When I got diagnosed in hospital, I had 10 funerals I was looking after at that time, and I couldn't conduct any of them. And so the logistics of that was huge, but they were all amazing, and they all took them off my hands, or I handed them over. And, I wrote a couple of eulogies in hospital for families because I knew I had done that work. I knew how those eulogies needed to sound. And then I handed them over to the funeral director and they dealt with the rest. So, but once all that was sorted, this handful of funeral professionals have just been so amazingly supportive, checking in with me, meeting me for coffee or dinner, just asking how I am. And also, when I'm ready, they've been willing to talk about the possibility of my return to being a funeral celebrant. And that, I'm hoping, is imminent. But I'm going to need their support doing that. And they don't owe me anything, but they're just good people. And that's why, A, I like to work for them anyway, but B, I know when I return, they will be looking out for me. So making sure I don't do too much, because fatigue is the main side effect of my targeted therapy. So I probably won't be able to work at the rate that I was working before. So I'll need to readjust my working hours. But also I think they will be sensitive to the families they ask me to support initially whilst I build up my emotional strength again. So yeah, I'm really grateful that I have them as colleagues and friends, because I don't want to let anyone down. I'm so grateful. And my local crematorium colleagues at Sedgemoor, at the Westerly Crematorium there, they've been amazingly supportive as well. Can we do anything? And there isn't much anyone can physically do, but love and support and thoughts of if they could cure cancer, I'd be absolutely fine. So I'm really grateful, and I feel as though when I return, I will be well supported. And it's a busy industry. It is an industry that, it's fair to say, can be cliquey. I don't know. Have I experienced that? It is a competitive industry. We are businesses at the end of the day. I always say that to other celebrants. I'm not a celebrant who does this because I want to give back. I run my celebrancy as a business, I just so happen to find it incredibly rewarding, but it pays my mortgage as well. So yeah, I'm really looking forward. I know I'll be well supported.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it doesn't surprise me that you've had such great support from the community as a whole. So your experiences don't surprise me in the slightest. And from a Wesley Group perspective, we see so many great acts of kindness and support every day at all levels. So that doesn't surprise me one bit. Having walked alongside so many grieving families now in your 5 years, and now facing your own health journey, what do you think people most often misunderstand about death?
It still fascinates me, Matt, that people won't contemplate it. I've been banging on about this even before I got diagnosed with cancer. I find it fascinating that there are still so many people that will not contemplate their mortality, that don't accept that every single one of us will die. The richest person in the world, the luckiest person in the world, the most intelligent person in the world. We all, our lives are limited, some more than others. And that fascinates me. And I can tell when I meet someone and they ask me what I do for a job and I tell them, they're either absolutely fascinated or they'll run a mile. And it's because they don't want to contemplate their own death, and I think as a society we should be better at that. And I was a keen user of social media when I was working as a celebrant, and I will resume that when I go back to work, because just very gently, just quietly, just chipping away, feeding out those messages that it is something to consider. It is something to think about. It doesn't need to be the sole focus of your life, but, because the better prepared we are and the better those people that love us are prepared, then it's going to make that time when it comes less stressful and less painful, perhaps, and allow us time to grieve in the truest sense of the word grieve, rather than be bogged down with, well, I don't know what version of time to say goodbye he wanted, or I don't know whether they wanted to be cremated or buried. They wouldn't talk about it. And I don't know whether they're religious or not. A simple conversation. So yeah, that surprises me every day, really, that people are still scared of death and dying. And I was inspired, Matt, I must mention, by my late grandmother. My nan died 3 years ago. She was 3 weeks away from 91. And she was the most pragmatic person when it came to talking about death. She was, a big advocate for, assisted dying. She campaigned for it, just very quietly, writing to her MP and whatever. But she was very pragmatic about death, and she very much believed in the circle of life. And I conducted her funeral at Sedgemoor Crematorium, actually. And I remember some of my family saying, well, how can you do that? Like, with it, and it's like, this is a massive honour, I knew exactly what my nan wanted at her funeral. I knew exactly how she felt about her circle of life. She was more than happy to complete it. She'd come into this world, she'd completed her circle. She wasn't a religious lady, and she left it. And so I'm inspired by her, actually, on quite a regular basis. And I won't be able to convert everyone to happily sitting and having a pint and talking about their funeral, but I'll try my best.
Absolutely. From a family perspective, knowing what your loved one wanted and wants, I don't want to say that it makes it easier, because I don't think anything makes it easier, but it gives you a readiness and you're prepared to be able to navigate that part of the journey. And actually, again, a personal experience would be that not having that understanding, not having that knowledge of what they wanted can prolong and make that processing even more difficult, because you're trying to process the loss of a loved one. And then amongst all of that, you're trying to work out what they wanted. And are you doing it right? And you kind of go into overdrive and you leave no stone unturned. But actually, if it is as simple as, I want X, Y, and Z, I want, opening music here, I want reflection here, all those sorts of things. It takes a load off, I think, is what I'm trying to say. So, we are big advocates as a group. We are big advocates of having those conversations for no other reason than trying to help and support those that loved ones leave behind. So it's a very interesting perspective that you have as well. And I think as we move forward and as kind of the world around us changes, I'm finding a lot more alignment between people on that and wanting to have those conversations. So what's been the most surprising or uplifting thing you've experienced amidst everything since April? Because it's clearly been a very tricky period.
Gosh, good question. I've been quite surprised. I've learned a lot about human beings and how they respond to news like this. Some good, some surprising, some disappointing. I've learned a lot about how it is possibly possible to live with stage 4 cancer rather than die from it. And that's a message that I don't think as a society we've really got to quite yet. But that's something I want to advocate for, because we hear stage 4 cancer and we assume death sentence. But actually, thanks to modern medicine, research, science, many people are living with stage 4 cancer. Stage 4 means it's in multiple places in your body, so it's unable to be dealt with because it's too entrenched in your body's systems. Metastatic cancer, mine is that, and it's in 3 places. So, but when I was first told, I thought that was it. I literally started to put my affairs in order. My funeral wishes were already written, but, I started to really deal into the nitty gritty of my funeral wishes and putting my household in order, because I thought I was about to die. And then when I came through the initial pain of being poorly and felt a bit physically better, and I was able to research my type of cancer and realise that some people are living with it and living relatively well with it, that I had hope. And I think hope has there's always hope. Hope has been the thing that's been getting me through. Surprising, I think, is more just people's reactions and the fact that as a society we're perhaps not very good about engaging our brain before we speak, and people wanting to share with me the experiences of their loved one dying of lung cancer, which is too, I don't need to really know that right now. And that's part of the reason why when I return to work, I think my funeral professional colleagues will support me in, maybe if a loved one has lost their life due to lung cancer, maybe I'm not the best celebrant for you right now. And I say that really openly and frankly because, it's super important that I am on my game when I return to being a funeral celebrant. There's no cutting Emma any slack. I need to be professional. So yeah. So really, I think the most surprising thing has been the reaction of others. Mainly good, but some a little challenging.
So thank you for that. And before you go, what's one piece of advice you'd give to anyone that is listening?
Life is fragile. I've said it several times already in this podcast. But in April this year, 25th of April, and I was in my hospital bed thinking I was feeling better because I had a lung infection, and 3 doctors walked into my room and 2 of them wouldn't look me in the eye, and they told me I had cancer. It's one of those life-defining moments that will never leave you, and it's a real wake-up call. You cannot live every day as if it's your last. It is not practical, emotionally or financially. However, the thing that I'm having to remind myself of on a daily basis now is to live in the moment, because we don't know how many moments we'll have, and they might be in double digits, triple digits, you might have years. You just do not know. Life is fragile, and so where possible, live in the moment and be grateful. Be grateful and, and do the things you want to do whilst you can do them. I don't have a bucket list, Matt. I'm not going to be climbing a blimmin' mountain, or if anyone thinks I'm going to, be running a marathon or anything. No. But, at the moment it's, right, next week I'm going on holiday to Cornwall, and then my next thing will be, right, okay, Christmas. Let's do Christmas. And then it's my birthday, and then and then my life going forward is 3 months to 3 months. I will have a scan every 3 months for the rest of my life, and every other scan will be also of my brain to check that the cancer hasn't travelled there. That's my life going forward, and I would never have chosen it to be that way, but it is what I'm faced with. So life is fragile. That would be my message.
Thank you, Emma. It's an incredibly powerful message to end on, and I want to thank you again for your transparency and your experiences, both professional and personal. I have absolutely no doubt that your story is going to help people understand something they may be going through, or someone that might be going through something similar to yourself. For people that are listening and may want to learn a little bit more about either yourself or the cancer type that you have, do you have any kind of important links for them or anything like that? They might be able to find out a bit more about you.
Yeah, so when I return to work, all my website and social medias will be up and running at Emma the Celebrant. And if you wanted to find out more about ALK Positive lung cancer, then just Google ALK Positive lung cancer. It's an amazing charity. It's a small charity. This cancer is very rare. They believe only around 400 people a year in the UK get it. 70,000 in the world a year. So this charity is amazing, and they've really supported me and my husband since I got diagnosed. So yeah, just look up ALK Positive Lung Cancer UK if you're interested. Anyone with lungs can get lung cancer, and I don't say that to scare you, because this is rare, but I was initially dismissed as the possibility of having lung cancer because I didn't tick any of the boxes, but I did. So it's just that awareness that if you think there's something wrong with you and you're not sure, just push and get yourself checked.
Emma, thank you very much for that. And thank you to everyone who has listened to this episode of Before You Go. This episode has been brought to you in partnership with Empika PR. If you found today's conversation to be beneficial, please like, subscribe, and share the podcast. It really helps us reach more people who could benefit from hearing about it. And until next time, take care. Bye-bye.